and were all flawed to the point of being worthless. And at the same time, there were many other studies that clearly demonstrated that MSG was toxic and dangerous.
Neuroscientist Dr. John Olney has studied MSG for decades. He rarely gives interviews because of the unwanted attention it incites.
My background is in experimental neuropathology. I conducted a study of monosodium glutamate and its toxicity potential for infant animals, and I found that glutamate destroys nerve cells in the developing infant animals' brains.
I could understand his shyness about appearing on camera because he has played a key role in the incriminating evidence against the processed food industry for several years. His findings are shocking to people, especially to parents of young children. But when traveling away from home, the question then becomes for Garrett, what do you eat? At his home in Alaska, or visiting the Gerson family, his diet was virtually devoid of any processed food. It takes a little extra work to seek out delicious organic produce and/or restaurants. Stop! After all this, I didn't think. It's too late. The chemicals in this fast food were working their magic on the boy. He ate this meal, actually 2 meals, like he was possessed. To me, it was disappointing, but to force the issue would likely backfire. He was free to make his own decisions. Three hours later, on a plane headed for Jackson, Mississippi, the results were in. In Jackson, Mississippi, the boy met up with an incredible family of photographers, the Blaylocks. Dr. Russell Blaylock is a renowned board-certified neurosurgeon and author of several books on cancer, excitotoxins, and health. It is here where Garrett reoriented himself to a healthy snack, but unbeknownst to the lad, I had a little test planned.
The mass consumption of this excitotoxin substance in the food is interfering with people's ability to think and remember and use language so that our children no longer have the capacity that their parents had. And I think this is getting compounded because there are more and more foods with multiple forms of these excitotoxins, 4, 5, 6 in a single food, so that our children, and small children in particular, are consuming such large amounts. It interferes with the development of the brain as well as destroying these connections between the brain cells. And that interferes with brain function, and that's what we're seeing nationwide, and in fact worldwide in the industrialized nations. The reason that the food manufacturers are telling the public that it's safe is because they're making a huge profit off of it. And it's hard to compete with their fellow manufacturers if they don't use the MSG because it's a powerful taste-enhancing effect. So they just tend to ignore all of this research, even though it's literally thousands of studies, and the studies keep growing, proving beyond any doubt in the reasonable mind that, in fact, this is harming people's brains. It's producing gross obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, infantile diabetes, atherosclerosis. A great number of diseases are now connected to what's happening with MSG exposure.
Chips were delivered to the table that were laden with MSG.
And one of the things that people don't understand, this can be a silent toxicity. That is, they don't even know it's occurring. A lot of people will tell me, well, I don't react. I don't have these symptoms of nausea and vomiting and headaches. Well, a lot of people that are exposed to MSG will not have these symptoms, but they get the same damage. And this occurs over a very long period of time, decades. So the brain cells are being destroyed, and until they lose a number of brain cells, they're not even aware that they're under this toxicity. It's known in neurology that you have to lose about 90% of the neurons in a particular area of the brain before you develop symptoms. So by the time you develop these symptoms like dementia or Parkinson's disease, etc., you've already lost 90% of the neurons in that part of the brain, and that's what's very important. Another really new important finding is that it's strongly connected to the growth of cancer. And we know that glutamate, when it's increased in a person's diet, makes their cancer grow very rapidly and becomes highly invasive. That means it spreads all over their body. The problem is, no one's telling cancer patients they need to be very cautious about taking in these food additives because it makes their cancer grow much faster and become more invasive, which means they're less likely to survive their cancer.
Garrett never did eat any of those chips. He wants all the brain cells he has. The number of food products that contain MSG but don't actually label it as such is now almost infinite. The only way to avoid this is to buy organic products and whole foods. What the boy also discovered was that this was further confirmation of Gerson's discoveries 80 years earlier. In order to provide a balanced report on the subject of processed foods, the boy then flew from Jackson, Mississippi to Omaha, Nebraska, with the hopes of interviewing a ConAgra Foods public relations representative. After several phone calls and a faxed message, he thought there was reason to be optimistic, but he was wrong. No one at this huge facility would speak. It was confusing and disturbing to the boy temporarily. For me, this heavily guarded facility and non-communicative position was supreme arrogance, especially when considering that they are feeding us, or some of us, every day. It reminded me of facilities in Alaska, such as the military's HARP project, that raises questions about the weather, or my experiences in trying to get interviews with oil companies that turned me down flat. The native people of the North and their concerns are low priority. The boy tried to contact ConAgra twice more with no reply. All was not lost, however. We went to Omaha's Mayberry Park, where Garrett found great delight once more.
We have to go back to Hippocrates. He said, first of all, do no harm. Well, every single drug does harm. Then he also said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food. That's very important because food will nourish you and heal you. It's natural materials which your body knows how to utilize. Your body has evolved over millions of years to use. Whereas these huge, incredibly profitable companies all over the world are damaging, liver toxic, and cause disease. So how can they really be considered a medicine if they're causing disease?
If we couldn't speak to food manufacturers, then maybe we could speak to a food engineer. Meet Carol Hornline. We met her at the St. Louis, Missouri airport and were driving her to a radio interview. Along the drive, there was plenty of time for sightseeing. Garrett, in particular, now had time to digest a lot of information. He overheard much of the conversation going on in the front seat about another food additive that made him remember.
In 1974, I petitioned the commissioner of FDA about some evidence I had found pertaining to aspartame causing brain lesions.
But despite all warnings, the former head of GD Searle, Donald Rumsfeld, forced it into the food market anyway. As a highly paid and highly respected food engineer, Carol was right in line to work with this dangerous substance. It wasn't long before she was riddled with tumors from her pituitary gland to her ovaries. She ballooned in weight and continues to have health problems. Carol will never be the same again. She no longer wants to work as a food engineer because, quote, I can't work at a place where I'm knowingly poisoning people.
This story is actually worse than the tobacco story because at least you can choose not to smoke. Food, you have no choice.
We were now at the radio station where Carol would have a chance to tell the world her story and what food additives like MSG and aspartame